All right, welcome back to Bigfoot's Wilderness. New encounter story for you tonight, and it is called Hunted Bigfoot. So let's go ahead and jump into it. From my earliest recollections, I always knew of Bigfoot, but always believed they weren't real. Why? Because no one could prove otherwise. I was pretty sensible at a young age, and skeptical too. Dinosaurs once ruled the earth. There were fossils found around the world, and still are, and as far as I wanted to believe, that was it. But now I know there is something else out there, and it's a lot like a monster. Maybe not as gigantic and ferocious as a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but just as intimidating. It left me vulnerable and shaken, and even decades later, I can't enjoy the thing that I love more than anything, the forest. I'm not claiming it's PTSD, but I can't think of anything else. Like most kids riding in their parents' cars traveling from point A to point B, I would stare out the window at the rocky and jagged mountains and forests along the interstates of Pennsylvania. I'd put down my favorite dinosaur book and pick up my little sketch pad while I gazed out the window. It was calming to me. Every picture I drew was like bringing a piece of it back to my house. I wanted to walk every trail and explore each and every mountain. My parents and I would play games like punch buggy or try to find wildlife, especially deer since we'd see them more frequently. We lived near Williamsport, Pennsylvania. A really nice town, but as far as I was concerned, it was too far from where I wanted to be, the Appalachian Trail. I discovered the trail while watching a documentary. My uncle was familiar with it, and he told me stories about how unconquerable the trail was and that very few people had made the 2,200-mile walk from Maine to Georgia. Now, this was back in the late 80s. The AT was not for the faint of heart, he said. My uncle told me that I'd have to train for it if I was serious. Listening to him, it sounded pretty daunting. There were plenty of parks and places to explore near my little town, but my parents weren't hikers or campers. They didn't even own hiking boots and had absolutely no interest as well or money to just go out and buy all the equipment needed. Being 13, I set aside a few dollars from birthdays and holidays whenever I could, and years later, even as a senior in high school, I continued to contribute to the fund. If you think kids don't have bucket lists, you're absolutely wrong. I not only wanted to travel and hike, but I wanted to work outdoors. I begged my parents to take me to the Appalachian Trail for what seemed like years, and it probably was. Neither of them were in any kind of shape to handle the rugged, rocky terrain in our state of Pennsylvania. Once I'd bring it up, the eye rolls weren't far behind. So let's fast forward a few years. At this point, I'm 18, and after some part-time jobs and paper routes, I was getting closer to my objective: a car. Soon, I wouldn't have to rely on rides to get to places. I'm pretty sure most, if not all of my friends were sick of hearing about my outdoor quest. I was nothing short of persistent, but despite my deep interest, I really wasn't completely consumed with it. I participated in various sports which really took me to a new level in physical fitness. I had stamina and strong legs. My senior year was almost over. Since I'd been accepted to Ohio State, this was my summer to make my way to the trail in my own car. I'd reached out to my uncle for any advice since he was the closest authority figure with any experience hiking. We discussed having a goal, something to shoot for. Speaking of something to shoot for, he asked me if I had a firearm. It was very nonchalant. Of course I didn't, and I suspect what he did, if it were in the present, meaning now, would be considered highly illegal. He lent me his .38. I'd feel better if you had something to protect yourself with. Remember this, if you remember anything. People are the most dangerous animals in the world. Got that? He and my dad sat down with me and we consulted a map to try and figure out where and what I would do, and of course, let me borrow his gun. My parents were pretty liberal about having your own space and being independent. They weren't too concerned about my adventure, but they weren't good with the gun. I'd gone target shooting with my dad's brother a dozen times, if not more. I was more than capable. My uncle and I just needed to convince my dad. When school finally ended, my dad did drive me that Friday right to pick up my new car from the shop. It wasn't new by any means, just new to me. I had purchased a used 1984 Jeep CJ7 with bald tires, bad shocks, and a clutch that badly needed to be replaced. After those repairs, my budget was almost blown, but I could feel the freedom already. I left out on a Sunday, heading south, following the Susquehanna River and then picking up 81 and then over to 78. Call it being a little too prepared or just a rank amateur, but for one person, I may have gone overboard. Packing apparently more than I needed. I was never a Boy Scout, and I'd never stayed overnight in the woods before, but food and supplies were definitely my biggest burden. But I carried what I thought I needed and proceeded down the trail looking for the next designated spot that I could build a fire. After getting settled, I proceeded to set up my spot and make lunch, until I heard several gunshots and quite a commotion coming from a northern direction ahead of me on the trail. I knew that some parts of the AT are accessible to hunting, and I decided maybe the best thing to do would be to make some noise so they knew I was close. I clanged on the cast iron pan with my knife a few dozen times and hollered, and again, more gunshots, what sounded like a roar, that followed. I could only describe it as very loud and ending with a long moan. The sheer volume of noise made me think it was as close as the gunshots, less than 50 to 60 yards away. I stood slowly with my uncle's .38 drawn. My heart was racing. I scanned the immediate area but couldn't detect anyone or anything. The noise it made, I mentally repeated it in my head. It sounded like anything I couldn't place. Not a bear or a mountain lion. Definitely not a coyote or even a dog. I sort of joked to myself that it sounded like a T-Rex. I continued to look around, walking up the trail, shouting out to the hunter, but no one responded. I walked the trail ahead slowly, and as I crossed some flat but jagged rocks, I could see something on the ground glistening ahead of me. Blood. Little spats of blood. There was a trail of it seemingly leading me away from where I was camped. I remember feeling a sigh of relief. It was around dusk, or maybe even a little earlier. I had a nice fire going and was getting ready to eat. I'd packed some steaks that were frozen and wrapped in foil and newspaper. I had my knife out trying to pry them apart. I pulled one out of the wrapping, got my pan out, and threw it on the already blazing fire and started cooking. I remember being bent over the pan cutting a potato with my knife when what I could only call was a shower of rocks landing on me and the campfire. I quickly stood up and in a rage turned and shouted, cursing out loud, to whoever pelted my back and head. I thought someone was trying to have some fun at my expense. I charged and stepped out and away from the fire. I focused on the open area ahead of me, where I noticed that something that almost seemed to match the trees around us was breathing heavily and growled. Aside from being covered in a brown hair or fur, I immediately noticed that its legs were spread wide apart, and as I began to look up at this long, lanky being, it was tall, so tall, taller than any basketball player that came to mind by at least another foot. And it had a menacing look on what I could see of its dark face. It was clutching its left arm. I remember kind of shuddering and looking away for a moment, but then retraining my eyes on it. It's still there. What is this? Is that blood on its arm? I could see something else. Something in its left hand of the arm it was clutching, and it could see me too very clearly holding my uncle's .38. It seemingly growled again and almost seemed to slide behind one of the trees. Knock, knock, knock. It pounded on the tree it hid behind, and in the distance I heard a reply back of several knocks. I was all alone. My heart was racing. I'd broken out into a sweat. My legs felt like jello. But I had a gun, and I had every intention of using it. I yelled to it, "Get the hell out of here, or so help me God, I will shoot." And as I yelled it, I raised the gun, extending my arm. For a moment, we both spoke the same language. I said get out, and it proceeded to get out. It took a few cautious steps sideways and ran the path of least resistance to the trail. Once it hit the trail, its speed was incredible. I'd almost lost sight of it until it paused and then took a sideways glance at me. It disappeared in the rocks, the same rocks that were tearing my boots apart only a few hours earlier. For a moment, I felt pity. Why was he shot? What did he do? Did it matter? He was a monster, a Bigfoot. I always thought it was some kind of fable. I snapped out of it as, off in the distance, I could hear knocks. Every few seconds, knocks. Fear was motivating me now. It was still light out, and I quickly packed out. Maybe someone was looking out for me. My uncle, God. I could make it to my car in 30 minutes, or even less if I ran. That gun saved my life. I didn't drive home that night. I think I was too embarrassed to show up at home without even a night's stay under my belt. I drove back to a buddy's house and spent the night. I told him I was having car troubles and I didn't think the car could make the trip. I actually slept pretty good for the fact that I only slept a few hours. But my flashbacks were troubling me. Shadowy, tall figures. That's what I kept picturing in my head. About a week later, my girlfriend and I hiked around Little Pine State Park. Everything was fine until I heard the knocks again. I almost seemed to fall apart, breaking into a sweat, and directly ending and changing my direction back to the car. I told my girlfriend I was feeling sick, to which she totally believed as my face went pale. And that's my story. Decades later, it's still difficult for me to enjoy the woods. A gun brings me comfort. I still struggle to understand why this creature was shot, and why was he taking it out on me. Perhaps he's just a wild creature with no real intellect, just instinct. But he seemed to understand the other end of a gun. For those out there that think that Bigfoot is harmless, think twice. A warning to those: protect yourself at all costs, because Bigfoot may have other ideas.